There are three things my son-in-law thought belonged to him: the house my daughter lived in, the construction firm he ran, and the reputation he'd built on the back of a name he never once thought to look up. He was wrong about all three. There's a kind of silence that people mistake for weakness. I've lived with that silence for most of my adult life. My neighbors probably thought I was quiet because I had nothing to say. My daughter's husband thought I was quiet because I had nothing. He said as much at Thanksgiving dinner last November, loud enough that the gravy boat was still being passed when the words reached the far end of the table. Honestly, Cecile, he said to my daughter, not even looking at me, your dad's never going to get it together. Some guys just aren't built for it. My daughter looked at her plate. My grandson, who was 7 and didn't understand, kept eating. I poured myself more coffee and I did not say a word. I want to tell you about that silence. Because what happened in the 4 months after that dinner is the reason I'm sitting here now, in the kitchen of a house in Kelowna with a view of the lake, writing this down before I forget how it felt. I grew up in Sudbury, Ontario, the son of a miner who worked 30 years underground and retired with bad lungs and not much else. I watched my father come home gray with dust and still find a way to laugh at supper. That man never complained once. Not once in my life did I hear him say the world owed him anything. I think that's where I got it from. The habit of keeping things to myself, of building quietly, of not needing anyone to see what I was doing. I left Sudbury at 22 with a trade certificate, a truck, and about $400. I drove west because a friend told me there was work in Alberta, and he was right. I spent 3 years on job sites in Fort McMurray, saved everything I could, and eventually moved to British Columbia. By the time I was 35, I had my red seal, a small renovation company, and a reputation in the Okanagan Valley for doing good work and showing up on time. My wife Judith was a school teacher. She was the kind of woman who made every room feel calmer just by walking into it. We had our daughter, Cecile, in 1989, and she was the best thing either of us ever did. Judith passed away in 2014. Pancreatic cancer. 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I don't talk about that part much. But I want you to understand who I was by the time my son-in-law entered the picture. I was a 61-year-old widower who drove an old Silverado, wore the same brand of flannel shirt he'd been buying for 30 years, and spent most weekends either fishing the Okanagan River or refinishing furniture in my garage. I did not look like a man who had built anything worth noticing. That was, I came to understand exactly the problem. Cecile met Theo at a real estate networking event in Kelowna in 2019. He was 34, 10 years younger than her, and he had the kind of confidence that comes from never having been wrong in front of anyone who mattered. He'd grown up in Vancouver, university educated, done a stint in corporate project management, and decided the real money was in residential construction. He wasn't wrong about that. He just had a very particular idea of where his success came from. The first time I met him, we shook hands, and he looked at my truck and said, "Nice classic," in a tone that was not actually a compliment. I told him I'd replace the engine myself. He nodded the way people nod when they've already stopped listening. He and Cecile got married in the summer of 2020, small ceremony because of the restrictions that year. I walked her down the aisle in the backyard of a rented property in West Kelowna, and I thought, watching her face, that whatever I felt about Theo, none of it mattered as long as she was happy, so I kept my mouth shut. I had a gift for that. What I did not tell Theo, what I had not told Cecile in any detail, because she'd never asked and I'd never felt the need to explain, was that my little renovation company had grown. Quietly, the way things grow when you reinvest every dollar and never spend money on things that don't earn money. By 2015, I had 6 crews working. By 2018, I had incorporated under a holding company, Hartwell Properties and Development Limited. Hartwell is my mother's maiden name. The house Cecile and Theo lived in was owned by Hartwell Properties. The construction firm Theo ran, a mid-sized residential builder called Okanagan Summit Contracting, had been struggling when Theo came across it. He'd approached me in 2021 looking for investment. He presented it as an opportunity, very professional. Slides and everything. I'd listened carefully, asked a few questions, and said I might know someone who could help. 2 weeks later, through a numbered company, I purchased a controlling interest in Okanagan Summit. Theo was brought in as operations manager. He believed the investor was a real estate fund out of Calgary. He had no idea he was working for me. I'm not proud of the secrecy. That's the first thing I want to say. I've thought about it many times since. Whether I should have been more open, whether keeping everything behind numbered companies and holding entities was fair to my daughter, fair to Theo, fair to myself. A good friend of mine, a retired accountant named Douglas, told me back in 2022 that I was setting up a situation that could go sideways. "You're not being dishonest," he said, over beers on his back porch, "but you're not being fully honest either, and that's its own kind of problem." He was right. I knew he was right. I told myself I'd find the right moment to explain things. I kept not finding it. And then November came. Thanksgiving that year was at Cecile and Theo's place. It was me, my grandson Elliot, Theo's parents who'd driven up from the coast, and a couple of Theo's friends from the industry. Good meal. Cecile does a maple brine turkey that I think about sometimes. It was late in the dinner when Theo started talking about a contract he'd landed. A development project in Lake Country, 22 units. The kind of deal that would have been out of reach for a company Okanagan Summit size 2 years earlier. He was proud of it. I understood that. I was proud of it too, in a way, because I'd watched the company grow from a struggling operation into something real. But then one of his friends asked him how he'd gotten into the business, and Theo told a story I'd never heard before. In this version, he'd identified an undervalued asset, secured investor backing through his own network, and turned around a failing company using his management approach. He didn't mention that the investor backing had come through channels I'd arranged. He didn't mention that the operational turnaround had been supported by relationships I'd built over 30 years in the Okanagan. It was the version of events where he was the protagonist and I wasn't in it at all. His friend asked about family support. Theo laughed. "Cecile's dad's a handyman," he said. "Good with a hammer, not exactly a business mind." He glanced down the table at me. "No offense." "None taken," I said. "Honestly, Cecile." And this is when he said it, just like I told you at the start. "Your dad's never going to get it together. Some guys just aren't built for it." Cecile looked at her plate. Theo's parents looked uncomfortable but said nothing. I poured more coffee. Elliot asked if there was more stuffing. I thought about Douglas and what he'd said about the right moment. I thought about Judith and what she would have said to me in the truck on the way home. I thought about my father, who worked underground for 30 years and never once said the world owed him anything. I did not say a word. But driving home that night on the highway, the lake to my left black and still, I made a decision. Not an angry decision. Angry's loud, and I have always preferred quiet. It was a colder decision than that. A patient one. I would let Theo see clearly and without any possibility of misunderstanding exactly what he'd been dismissing. Not to humiliate him, not exactly, but because there are things a man builds over a lifetime that deserve to be seen. I called Douglas the next morning. He's been my accountant for 15 years, and he knows everything about the corporate structure, the holding company, the numbered companies, the properties. I told him what had happened at dinner. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So we're finally having the conversation." I said yes. He asked me what I wanted to do. I told him I wasn't sure yet, but I wanted to start with a review. Who owned what? What was exposed? What could be restructured without disrupting operations? He said he'd put together a document. Over the next 3 weeks, I also called my lawyer, a woman named Abigail, who handles corporate matters and has the kind of manner that makes complicated things feel manageable. Between the three of us, we mapped out everything. The house on Vineyard Drive where Cecile and Theo lived was owned by Hartwell Properties, which was wholly owned by me. The lease agreement was in Cecile's name, at a monthly rate significantly below market, something I'd set up years ago as a way of supporting her without making it feel like a handout. Theo had been living there for 4 years and, as best I could tell, had never once asked Cecile about the ownership structure. Okanagan Summit Contracting was owned through a numbered Alberta company, which was itself owned by Hartwell. Theo had an employment contract. He was not a partner. He had never been a partner. He had operational authority but no ownership stake. His salary, benefits, and the lease on the company truck he drove were all, ultimately, coming from me. I sat with that for a while, not with satisfaction, with something more complicated than that. He built real things inside that company. He made good hires. The Lake Country project was genuinely his idea, and it was a good one. I didn't want to take credit for what he'd actually done. I just wanted him to understand the foundation he'd been standing on. In January, I called Abigail and told her to draft a letter. Not a legal threat, just a factual communication on Hartwell letterhead to be delivered to Theo at the Okanagan Summit office. A letter introducing Hartwell Properties and Development Limited as the controlling shareholder of Okanagan Summit Contracting and requesting a formal meeting to discuss the company's strategic direction. I also asked Douglas to prepare a corporate overview, the full picture of Hartwell, the properties, the holdings, the history, something a person could read and understand in about 20 minutes. And then I had the harder conversation first. I called Cecile. She picked up on the second ring, the way she always does with me, and I could hear Elliot in the background doing something loud with what sounded like building blocks. I said, "I need to talk to you about something. It's going to take a little while. Are you somewhere you can sit down?" She was quiet for a second. "Dad, what's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," I said. "I should have had this conversation years ago. I'm sorry I didn't." I told her everything. Not the dinner. I didn't mention the dinner at all, because that wasn't what it was about. I told her about Hartwell, about the numbered company, about Okanagan Summit. I told her that the house she'd lived in for 6 years belonged to a company I owned. I told her that her husband's employer was, at the end of a corporate chain, me. She didn't say anything for a long time. I could hear the building blocks stop. Finally she said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I thought about that. "Because I didn't want you to feel like I was managing your life," I said. "I wanted to help you without you feeling helped." That was probably arrogant of me. She said, "Yeah, Dad, it was." She wasn't angry. She was something quieter than angry, which was harder to hear. We talked for almost 2 hours. She asked questions I should have been asked years earlier, and I answered all of them honestly. By the end of it, she said, "Okay, I need a few days." I said, "Take whatever you need." She said, "What are you going to do about Theo?" "I'm going to have a meeting," I said. The letter arrived at the Okanagan Summit office on a Wednesday morning in early February. Abigail had kept it brief and professional. Hartwell Properties and Development Limited, controlling shareholder, requesting a meeting at the company's offices the following Monday at 10 a.m. It was signed by me, in my own name, with my title, President and CEO, Hartwell Properties and Development Limited. I was told later by the office manager that Theo read the letter twice, put it down, picked it up, and read it again, and then sat very still for about a minute before asking her if she knew who this was. She said she didn't. He apparently spent the next 2 days trying to find out. Hartwell is not a secret. It's incorporated and registered. It files its returns. It's findable if you know where to look. But my name is not a famous name. It's not attached to anything splashy. I don't have a LinkedIn profile. I'm 63 years old, and I drive a Silverado. And most people who see me assume I'm either a retired tradesman or somebody's grandfather. Which I am. Both of those things. I don't know the exact moment he put it together. That the H in Hartwell might have something to do with my mother's maiden name, or that the registered address was a property management office in West Kelowna he'd driven past 100 times. But I know he called Cecile on the Friday before the meeting. I know this because she called me afterward. She said, "He figured it out." I said, "I know." She said, "He's angry." I said, "That's okay." She asked if I were sure about the meeting. I told her I was. Monday morning, I drove myself to the Okanagan Summit office, which is in a low industrial building off Highway 97, and I arrived 10 minutes early the way I always do. The office manager showed me to the boardroom, brought me a coffee without being asked, black, which is the only way I drink it, and closed the door. Theo came in 4 minutes after 10. He sat down across from me, and for a moment he just looked at me, and I could see him working through several different responses at once and not quite landing on one. I put the corporate overview Douglas had prepared on the table and slid it across to him. Then I put a second document beside it, the lease agreement for the house on Vineyard Drive, with Hartwell Properties named as landlord. I thought we should have a proper introduction, I said. He looked at the documents. He looked at me. How long, he said. I've owned Hartwell for about 20 years, I said. We acquired a controlling interest in this company in 2021. He was quiet. I could see him recalculating things, conversations, decisions, statements he'd made in boardrooms and at dinner tables. The house, he said. Cecile has known since last month, I said. I told her before I sent the letter, whatever happens from here, that's between you and her. He looked at the corporate overview. He flipped through it slowly. When he got to the assets page, I watched his face. It's a long page. Why are you doing this? He said finally. I thought about that question for a moment because I wanted to give him a real answer, not a satisfying one. Because I built something, I said, and I think it's time it was seen. He didn't say anything to that. I'm not here to make your life difficult, I said. You've done good work for this company. The Lake Country project is solid. That was your deal, and you should be proud of it. My intention is to continue operations with you in your current role, with a proper shareholder agreement in place and full transparency going forward. I've asked Abigail, my lawyer, to prepare documentation. He nodded slowly. He was looking at the table. There's one other thing, I said. The house on Vineyard Drive. I'd like to transfer the title to Cecile directly, as a gift. I should have done that years ago. I paused. That's between her and me. I just wanted you to know. He looked up then. His expression was something I didn't expect. Not anger anymore. Something more like vertigo. Like a man who has stepped onto a floor he thought was solid and felt it give slightly underfoot. I didn't know, he said. I know you didn't, I said. That's partly my fault. We sat with that for a moment. He said, at Thanksgiving. Don't, I said, not harshly, just quietly. We don't need to go over that. He nodded. I stood up, put on my jacket, and we shook hands at the door. His grit was different than it had been the first time. Less performance in it, more just a hand. Cecile called me that evening. She talked to Theo. She said he'd come home from work and sat down at the kitchen table and told her everything, the whole meeting, in detail. She said he'd been honest about what he'd said at Thanksgiving, which surprised her more than anything else. She told me Elliot had asked at dinner why Daddy was so quiet. She laughed when she said that, and it was the first time I'd heard her laugh in a few weeks, so I held on to that. She said, he wants to apologize to you. I said, he doesn't have to. She said, I know, but I think he needs to. We talked about the house. She cried a little when I told her it was hers. She said I didn't have to do that. I told her I'd bought it in 2008 with the intention of eventually giving it to her, and I was only about 15 years late. She laughed again. I told her not to thank me. She said, you're impossible, you know that? I said, your mother said the same thing. Theo and I met for coffee in March. Just the two of us, at a Tim Hortons on the edge of town, because I've always preferred Tim Hortons to anywhere that describes its beverages in more than 3 words. He was on time. He ordered a medium dark roast. He sat across from me and said what he needed to say, and I listened without interrupting. He was honest. I'll give him that. He said he'd constructed a version of himself that needed me to be smaller than I was, and he didn't have a good reason for it, except that it was easier than asking questions. He said he'd been so focused on proving himself that he'd stopped looking at what was actually around him. I said, I could have made it easier for you to see. I should have. He said, why didn't you? I said, because I learned a long time ago that people only see what they're looking for, and you weren't looking. He thought about that. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup the way people do when they're thinking, and he looked out the window at the parking lot for a while. What do I do with this? He said. Not about the company, not about the house, about all of it. Same thing you do with any foundation, I said. You build on it properly this time. He nodded. We sat there for another half hour and talked about the Lake Country project, about the shareholder agreement, about a couple of other opportunities Hartwell had been watching. By the end of it, we were talking like two people who were actually on the same side, which, it turned out, we had been the entire time. I drove home along the lake. It was March, and the water was still very cold, that deep blue it gets before the weather turns, and the hills on the far shore were still carrying snow. I put the radio on low, CBC, some kind of jazz program, and I drove slowly because I was in no hurry. I thought about my father, driving home from the mine in a car that burned oil. I thought about Judith beside me on this same road 20 years ago, pointing at the hills and saying she could never get tired of that view. I thought about Cecile, 7 years old, asleep in the back seat. There are things you build over a lifetime. Most of them don't have a sign on them. Most of them nobody sees until the moment they need to. And that's all right. That was always all right. I got home, put the kettle on, and sat at the kitchen table with the view of the lake and the hills and the last of the afternoon light moving across the water. The silence in my house is the silence of a life that is exactly what it appears to be. Nothing hidden underneath it. Not anymore. And that, I think, is the best thing I've built. I keep thinking about the drive home from that Tim Hortons in March. The lake was that deep blue it gets before spring really arrives, and there was still snow on the hills across the water, and I had the radio on low. Nothing dramatic. Just a man in a truck driving home. I don't think what happened to Theo was punishment. I want to be honest about that. He's not a bad person. He made the mistake that a lot of people make when they're young and ambitious and hungry to prove something. He decided who people were before he actually looked at them. He needed me to be smaller so that he could feel larger. I understand that. I've met that version of myself and other people enough times to recognize it without hating it. But here's what I've come to believe after 63 years of building things quietly in places nobody was watching. How you treat people when you think they can't do anything for you is the truest thing about you. Not your deal-making, not your presentation, not the projects you close. The moment at the dinner table when you think the older man at the end isn't listening. That's when you show what you're actually made of. Theo failed that moment. And the consequences that followed weren't something I imposed on him. They were something the situation had always contained. Waiting. My father used to say that a man's character is the only thing he actually owns. Not his house, not his truck, not his job title. His character. The way he treats a stranger. The way he keeps a promise when nobody's checking. The way he shows up year after year for the people and the work in front of him without needing anyone to applaud. I watched him live that way for 30 years underground in Sudbury, and I thought I understood it. It took most of my own life to actually understand it. What I know now is that intelligence without decency is just a sharper tool for making the same mistakes faster. Theo is smart. He always was. But smartness alone doesn't tell you to look up who owns the company before you decide its investors nobody worth knowing. Wisdom does. And wisdom is what you get when you've been wrong enough times to start asking better questions. I also know that nothing I built came from a single good idea or a lucky break. It came from showing up when I didn't feel like it, from keeping agreements I could have quietly walked away from investing in the Okanagan Valley when people told me the market wasn't ready. 30 years of small decisions made carefully, made honestly, made again the next morning. That kind of persistence isn't exciting. It doesn't make a good story at a dinner party, but it compounds. Quietly, the way interest compounds in an account nobody's watching. Cecile called me last week. Elliot had apparently asked at breakfast why Grandpa's company had a funny name. She'd told him it was his great-grandmother's name. He thought about that for a second and then asked if he could have waffles. She laughed telling me that. I laughed too. I think about Judith sometimes on that drive along the lake. What she'd say. I think she'd say, I waited too long, and she'd be right. But she'd also say it ended the way it was supposed to. Quietly. Honestly. With everybody in the room finally knowing where they stood. That's enough. It was always enough.